Good morning, and Interopen is delighted to host, with our NHS England and NHS Digital member organisations, the Standards in Action Interoperability Priorities presentation. Thank you all for giving up your time to attend. My name is Amir Merkar. I am a GP and co-founder and co-chair of Interopen. After my introduction, I will hand over the presentation to Dr. Gareth Thomas and Indy Singh. A special thanks to both who are on their holiday this week and also any other members who have just joined in the same boat. So Gareth is the SRO for the Integrated Care Programme in NHS Digital and the CCIO for Greater Manchester LICRA. Indy Singh is Head of Architecture and Cybersecurity in NHS England. So why does Interopen exist? We are a member organisation that has organically grown since 2016. Where we were initially founded by vendors. And today, we are an open collaboration of individuals, industry, standards organisations, and health and care providers working together to accelerate the development of open interoperability standards in health and social care. In the presentation, underlined areas have hyperlinks to relevant Interopen material, which you can surface later. Over recent months, we have been exploring a draft life cycle of how interoperability standards might be developed through to adoption, and that life cycle is hyperlinked for people to peruse later. The membership has grown to over 260 organisations, so you can see them all through that link, with 160 plus being vendors. A key achievement is the community's involvement in curating 31 of the UK's first Care Connect fire profiles, which are listed on the HL7 fire server, which can serve as the basis of many interoperability exchange interactions and are part of the National Transfer of Care and GP Connect specifications. Additionally, for example, Connecting Care, one of our provider members, has recently been sharing how they have worked with their vendors and teams to implement some of these locally for medication information sharing. And other areas are similarly working with these standards. And on the 14th of November, we're pleased to have our inaugural hackathon that now involves at least 30 vendors from Interopen. Our focus of interoperability, however, must always be patient care and clinician benefit. The underlined hyperlink heading goes to our website describing who we are, our visions and our values. And our first value is to put health and social care users at the heart of everything we do. With that in mind, we've been developing a key patient narrative called Michael's Story to help us stay focused on this value. So for medication reconciliation, Michael's story describes the information exchange of Michael's discharge medication prepared by the hospital pharmacist, flowing seamlessly to the GP system, allowing the GP to accept or amend changes to his medication. For the out-of-hour or urgent care centres, Michael might call when he has an allergy reaction to an over-the-counter medication. They'll be able to document that and share it back with the GP and potentially book him an appointment for a review. And for Michael himself to be engaged more, become more involved and in control of his own medications via apps that are in sync with his GP medications, with helpful reminder prompts and links off to other information resources. And a narrative such as this was part of the patient thread of the 2017 Interop Summit, and it has lots of educational links, website content, YouTube videos are available here. This slide shows Interopen's current board structure and key partner organisations that are working together to drive forward our vision. All our board meetings contents are open and transparent and accessible via the hyperlink at the top. I'm pleased to also share today that we have agreed at our last board to increase our vendor representation from the current 2 to 4, and we will be planning another election soon. And finally, I wanted to end my introduction with an important concept that our board has been working with, and a key finding described in detail on page 33 of the hyperlink of the Making IT Work report chaired and authored by Dr. Bob Wachter, who is also the author of the Digital Doctor book. the report describes that health IT entails both technical and adaptive change, and Bob has been quoted elsewhere highlighting that health IT is the mother of all adaptive problems, and that's partly why we've got it wrong, stressing that we don't think enough about the importance of the people. And for our board, Interopen is all about co-production with our members. That is why today we are pleased to be inviting you all to help shape and deliver together the interoperability priorities for the service. And now I'd like to hand over to Indy Singh.
Thanks very much, Amir, and thanks so much all who've joined the WebEx. I just thought it was helpful just to provide a quick overview as to what we're looking to get out of this joint conversation in terms of the overall purpose of the session. So as Amir kind of outlined, it now really feels like a real opportune moment around with Interopen and the groundswell and the community coming together, initiatives such as the local health and care records, as well as Secretary of State's very strong ambition around interoperability and how we can use the standards-based approach to enable that. So really that's why we were very keen to have this session with this wide group of stakeholders, of which we're looking to jointly with you cover off a number of areas. One is around the key and common priorities around information sharing and interoperability. And part of that is around being able to reflect what we've already heard from the service, be it the PRSB, be it CCIO, CIOs, but really to then test it out with yourselves around what have we heard, what have we learned, but more importantly then how do we start and build upon this journey. So really a conversation with yourselves around, well, what are the key common priorities based on what we've already been made aware of, and then also how do we go to look about how we deliver and the ordering around the delivery of these key priorities. We recognise that we can't necessarily wait for everything to be in place, we need to progress, but at the same time there are certain building blocks and certain considerations that we need to take into account. And most importantly, that actually this often isn't just about the standards or just about the technology, but around the business processes and the workflow that need to be enabled. So what we'll look to take you through is on how we've looked to try and capture what we've heard so far from the service, be it around some of the foundations around information sharing, some of the care processes and some of the care coordination that enables, and also how, if we look to start focusing on a number of key areas, that will help serve both what localities are calling out immediately, but also in terms of some of the priorities around the long-term plan and the wider digital transformation portfolio. And so if we now look to move to the next slide. Great, so what we've tried to do here is build up the picture, because often the term interoperability and priorities can come in many shapes and forms. And what we tried to look here is to say, well, actually at a base level, there's the need to be able to share information safely and securely, so around being able to have a consistent representation of the terminology that we're talking about, the codes that are involved in the information, so that we all know we're talking about the same thing, but also around actually having, even at the most basic level, such things as the NHS number available, not only just at the point of information sharing, but actually at the point of care. And then being able to have a consistent set of definitions around what do we mean by medications, what do we mean by allergies, what do we mean by observations and pathology. And so, again, pointing to Amir's summary around the Care Connect profiles that have been curated through Interopen, which give a set of definitions of different parts of the record and its associated elements. So there's kind of a piece there that what we call foundations that we recognise that we need to build upon, but also we recognise that not everyone has all these foundations in place, and nor necessarily can we wait until everything is there in place. There is then building upon that a set of care processes, and again this has been, if we just go to the next build, these then highlighting some of the care processes that people have called out that we need to look to try and enable, be it around discharges, be it around social care handover, be it around appointments and scheduling, ambulance handover, but also about being able to share specific parts of the care record, be it around observations, allergies, pathology, and medications. So really there's a set of processes that use some of those foundations, but also allow us to kind of focus on particular priorities, as I said, be it around the handover of ambulance into acute, be it around the discharge from acute into GP, be it around being able to share structured medications. So we recognise that there are different areas that people have called out, and so there's a question really around, well, what is the natural ordering? What is what's the interlinkage between these things, and where should we start? And also recognise that we can't necessarily try and do everything for everywhere, so what are the one or two areas that we think will give us the highest value, but also the ones that we think practically we've got a clear implementation approach. And then the build that set enables, if we just move to the next build, is how by having those foundations and supporting a number of care processes, that can then start enabling us to support wider care coordination. So you'll see some of those priorities I'm sure you'll already be aware of, be it around end of life, be it around crisis care planning, and you'll see the ones that kind of in the olive green that have recently been called out by the local health and care record exemplars around some of their clinical priority areas. And so what we're looking to try and do through this conversation, and Gareth will come on now in terms of more practical clinical scenarios of this, is how do we take this kind of set of priorities that we're aware of, how do we get a better understanding as to what the service is looking to focus on and in what order, and actually how do we practically come out with an implementation approach. And also, we also recognise that there'll be areas that we haven't explicitly called out, but I'm sure we'll, hopefully through the community there'll be other areas that we need to add in, be it radiology, be it pathology, and other forms. So really, hopefully that kind of picture helps bring together both some of the foundations, some of the care processes, how that enables a set of priority care coordination areas, and really now is the question around, well, actually, what's the ordering, what's the route in which we should look to take these forward upon. I'll now hand over to Gareth around some of the practical application of this in terms of clinical scenarios.
Okay, thanks, Indy. Amir, can we just move to the next slide, if we can, please? So, firstly, just to say thank you for joining us on the call today. I'm Gareth Thomas. I know some of the folk on the call, others I've not met before, but just to say, we really value this opportunity to speak with the interopen community today about our interoperability priorities and understanding how.
Sorry, the current speaker is inaudible.
Hello.
Gareth, could you speak a bit louder? I think it's quite quiet.
If you come closer to your microphone, try that again.
Is that better?
You might have to.
You may have to shout slightly, Gareth.
Yeah.
Is that better? Can you hear me now?
Unfortunately, it's not much louder.
Okay. How about now?
Better.
Better. Okay.
Jonathan, can you hear that? Is that better for you, Jonathan, or should we?
Much better, thank you.
Thank you, Jonathan. Carry on, Gareth.
What I was just saying, Jonathan, thank you all for joining us on the call today, and really appreciate this opportunity to discuss the interoperability priorities with the interopen community. This is something which really has been given new momentum by the recent Secretary of State announcement, and we're very keen that as a community we have a shared view around what is important and how we develop these things in a structured order. The format that Indy was just presenting really came from a view that actually what we need to do is view how these things can be constructed in terms of use cases and service need, rather than in terms of a program plan, which is why we've taken this three-tier approach. And again, as Indy was saying, there's a real opportunity at present to pull these things through in terms of the current work programs, most notably GDEs and LICRAs, and that's something which, as the incoming SRO for integrating care, I'm very keen that we pull through and get real visibility of these interoperability priorities and an understanding of how they can improve the service for citizens, and also improve operational efficiency. So what we've got on the slide here is we've taken a view of Indy's three-tier presentation, which he's just described, and used the use case of frailty, which we are using in GM Lycra as one of our clinical use cases. So with the idea that if we built a shared care plan for frailty, which you can see in the top olive green box there, how would this relate to our interoperability priorities and our development of these capabilities? So if we look at the bottom, you can see that for this shared care plan in the steady state, we would need, as highlighted in red, SNOMED CT, DM&D, NHS number, and the Care Connect profiles. And what these would mean for that shared care plan for the frail patient is that in terms of care processes, again, highlighted in red, you can see that the key information we would want within that care plan, that shared care plan across a locality in Greater Manchester, we will be looking to have all those care processes present within that care plan. So pathology, OBS, meds, allergies, and the ability for the patient, most importantly, to interact with that record. And then at the top, you can say, well, if we had this shared care plan supported by these interoperability capabilities, what would this facilitate in terms of the service? And again, as an example, we've got the use of crisis care planning, integrated care planning, the facility for the patient to interact with a clinical hub, and also for us to bring in an end-of-life care plan within that shared care plan for the patient. So the principle here was to say, look, if we're going to develop these interoperability priorities, how do we build that foundational infrastructure with clear tiers such that we can identify use cases which pull through right to the front of the service the need to develop these functionalities? So that's frailty in a steady state. Amir, if we just go on to the next slide. Am I still audible?
Sounds good to me.
Okay. Sorry, I'm shouting slightly, but
You're clear but very quiet.
Okay, I will continue to shout as loud as I can. So this is the case in which the first slide was around the frailty steady state. To develop this example, we've said, look, if the patient with frailty deteriorated and required an urgent admission, what other priorities in this case would be of value? Well, at the bottom, we've built on the staff ID, and the theory here was that, look, if this patient comes in via an emergency department, there may well be a lot of staff who are temporary workers or who would need to log on to multiple systems. So staff ID in this scenario becomes relevant. We'd also need an ambulance handover, and similarly a social care handover to alert social care services to the fact that the patient was no longer in the community. When the patient had been treated within the acute setting, there'd need to be an emergency care discharge summary. And then you can see at the top level, the pathways which will be facilitated would be urgent and emergency care, transfer of medicines on admission, and potentially something around delirium management. So again, this is an example, but the principle here is to demonstrate the value and the benefits to patient care from these interoperability principles at the level of either one patient or a local service. So the next slide, Amir, if we can move on, please. The next slide is a representation of the previous scenario at either individual citizen level or local service, and looks how this relates to broader strategic initiatives and also how we can actually use current implementation routes or current initiatives to bring these interoperability priorities through to the service. Next slide, if you can, Amir, please. So we can see that what we've talked about here will relate to both the digital transformation portfolio. I think that's highlighted on the next slide, Amir, and also the long-term plan. So what we're trying to do is bring the level of the patient and citizen care right up through the digital transformation portfolio and through to the themes within the long-term plan. And on the next slide, we've highlighted within the example of frailty how the following areas of within digital transformation portfolio and the NHS long-term plan would be reflected in our work to develop interoperability in the case of the patient with frailty. And then at the far left and right of slides, what we've done is said, well, look, if this is what we want to do, how do we actually make this happen? And on the right in the olive green there, you can see that we've identified several implementation routes whereby our work to develop interoperability standards could be pulled through into the service. And specifically in this case, we're talking around LICRAs as to how this may be enabled, but clearly there are others as we've identified on the slide there. And then on the far left, we've actually taken a different view and said, look, well, actually within the interoperability program, within integrating care, there are some functionalities which are being developed already within that program, and these could form vital building blocks to enable the integration of care and the interoperability to be delivered as we've just described over the last few slides. So here, for example, NHS Identity, we've talked about the record locator service, event management. You could see that these are fundamental building blocks which are already in construction, which we could reflect and use within this hierarchical demonstration of interoperability priorities. So that's really a summary of where we are with our thinking around the hierarchy of prioritization and how we can demonstrate benefits across that structure. I think there's a few key principles which I think are important around this. Indy has already described we don't necessarily need to deliver these all in the same order. So there are things which are possible to deliver for the benefits of patients in the service without having all these foundations in place. So we mustn't assume that this is an all or none phenomenon. We also need to think about how do we encourage adoption of these interoperability principles? What are the levers and incentives? How do we identify long-term opportunities versus quick wins? What are the things which we can deliver already within our existing work, or do we need a more strategic long-term view? What should be the early target use cases, the early target areas within these use cases? So, for example, within frailty, I talked about the example of a shared care plan, but it could be that within that shared care plan, we focus upon medicines integration, just as an example. How do we encourage the essential co-production with industry and with service users? How do we get that balance as we try to define our prioritization within this portfolio? And how do we determine what's the current level of the correct level of detail within the specifications that we're building? So how do we get the balance between perfection and something which is fit for future requirements versus a more pragmatic change and iterative approach and proof of concept? And there will be a point within that spectrum that we need to determine such that this is an appropriate standard to move us into the functionality that we wish to demonstrate. And then finally, I suppose within these structures, we've demonstrated how actually you can release benefits from the development of interoperability. But I think as well, we need a discussion around how do we demonstrate those benefits in terms of the fact that actually what we are demonstrating here is what we're delivering is a key enabler of this wider strategic plan. So how do we articulate those benefits, and how do we actually use that benefit realization to determine our prioritization within this framework? So that's really a summary of our foundational structures, illustrated that using the key clinical example of frailty, both in the steady state and the acute deterioration. Been able to reference that to the digital transformation portfolio and the long-term plan, and also some thoughts around the questions that we all need to consider when we're doing this prioritization and allocating resources to this program. So once again, thank you for joining us today, and really look forward to the questions both on the WebEx, but also via the subsequent questionnaire and feedback sessions. So Amir, back to you.
Thank you very much, Indy and Gareth, for that. So I just wanted to end, before we go to the questions, a little bit about the questionnaire that will come. So we would like yourselves and any of your colleagues who will watch this YouTube clip when we put it on the Interop Summit website to think about what we've talked about today, what Indy and Gareth have presented, and share your responses on this questionnaire that we've developed. there will be a hierarchy of sort of priorities that you'll come out with, but what we want to address is, of these foundational components and process components, what are priorities to you? So this is quite personal from where you're coming from. So it will cover care processes and handovers, foundations and care records, and also provide you with the ability to give you sort of narrative feedback. What are additional priorities that are important to yourselves, and what are the implementation challenges, and how might we or yourselves overcome them? So these responses will be analysed and a feedback report collated and shared openly by the end of November. Just do be mindful that there is a section on the questionnaire that says that if you don't want to be identified by your answers, let us know, and also try and craft any answers in a way that doesn't make yourselves identifiable if that's important to you. So we will release that on Discourse and on Riva and through our channels immediately after today's presentation. So we're coming to the end now, and I'd just like to hand over to Gillian and Sophie. Have you identified any questions for Indy and Gareth?
Hi, Mia. So I actually sat with Gillian and Sophie at the moment. So in terms of some of the key points of feedback around where it says sharing pathology information, really this needs to be about all investigations and not just around reports. So that's clearly a really helpful piece of feedback in terms of iteration, medication being a clear priority that's being called out. And also when we talk about the long-term condition work stream, where are we covering off the transition from children into adult services. So there's at least kind of three bits of iteration and feedback around this. There are then a couple of additional questions around implementation, and I think this is probably an important one to hopefully get more feedback and chat from the community upon. So the question from Jonathan around, will this predominantly be a program run from the centre or by local action? And I think that comes to a very significant change in the way that the approach is looking to be taking around interoperability. This is very much around locally driven, locally led delivery, and driven by priorities that the service is calling out, and then facilitated nationally in terms of the co-production around the standards or around the components and capabilities that are needed. Hence why one of the key bits, and I think Gareth kind of came onto it very well, was around, yes, you can have these sets of priorities, also including the points that are made around all investigations and so forth, but actually what does the service feel as being the natural ordering of the implementation of these priorities, recognizing that we can't necessarily do everything at the same time. And as part of that, then that helps to really articulate the benefit and the cost-benefit approach that's been taken around those priorities. So I think there's a couple of actions for us around updating some of the points within the actual framework itself around all investigations and transitions to LTC. But I think in that vein of locally led, locally driven delivery, based upon the priorities called about the service, it's kind of very much now to look to get a view around the service, around the ordering of that implementation.
Indy, Gareth, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Just to pick up on that point from Jonathan around the role of locally driven service versus the centre. I know you and I have discussed before, but just for the group, something I think is so important is that we have local visibility of the capabilities, the toolbox, if you like, of what is being delivered. And I think I'm speaking more here with my Lycra hat on rather than the SRO hat on. But I think what's so important is that the localities can understand what is being offered and being developed, and that we get an iterative approach and a shared approach as to how we develop the prioritisation and also the implementation in appropriate localities using appropriate use cases. So I think the challenge here is how we maintain that dialogue and that visibility of needs versus what is being developed, and get the two to interact with one another.
Thank you. Is there any other questions that have come out on the chat? No?
There's more of a technical pattern question around, not question as a statement really around moving from a classic FAR approach to a registry approach, which is helpful. I think we could pick that up as part of some of the more architectural definitions, but not necessarily directly related to the implementation ordering. I don't think there's any more comments that have come through yet. But I think we'd be very, very keen to understand, in the light of the vein of that locally led approach, what people would want to focus upon. Just one more comment.
Could I raise questions? Michelle Durham here. I'm a GP and I work on e-referrals at NHS Digital. And you might have covered this and I may have missed it. There's two things that I think we need as GPs. One is hospital-only prescriptions. I couldn't see anywhere that you were sharing that. It said discharge medication, but actually hospital-only prescriptions can create quite a lot of trouble with co-prescribing. I don't know how we're planning to share those. So these are prescriptions that only hospitals issue, that we might have very little even indication that they're being administered, especially things like HIV medication. There was one other point, and that's the plan of action. I understand about care planning, but who's doing what and when? So even simple things, you don't know who's ordering the 24-hour tape or the echo or other things. So just some insight into sharing who's ordering what and when, so hospitals can see that we've ordered a 24-hour tape, and likewise we can see if they've ordered it.
Michelle, it's Gareth. Thank you for that comment. Just a reflection on the medications point. I think that's something that is a really valid point, and there is some ongoing work, Indy, and we can perhaps pick that up with Ian in team as we look to define what's being done within the medications rec work.
Great. Is there anybody else who has any other questions? You could feel free to unmute. These discussions exist as threads both in Riva as well as Discourse, but the key opportunity is now to fill out the questionnaire. I'm going to post that in the chat with, actually, Helen, could you post the questionnaire now for everybody in the chat window for everybody? We'll put this on the Interop Summit YouTube, and I think if there are no other further questions, just want to say thank you to everybody for coming today, Indy and Gareth, and please do try and get these questionnaires in by next week.